The woman was already texting someone else before I finished my sentence. I had just told her the alternator was shot. $340, including labor. And she looked at her phone, looked back at me like I had said something embarrassing, and said, "I'm going to need you to do better than that. I am the owner of this shop. My name is on the sign out front in letters tall enough to read from the street, which is how it's been since my father's name was on it, and then since mine replaced his. I have been doing better than that for 11 years, every single day, for people who said please, and for people who didn't. I kept my voice level and told her the part cost what it cost. She said, "The guy on Yelp said this place overcharges women." She held up her phone so I could see the review on the screen. 2 stars. I had read that review before. I'd responded to it twice, with my name attached, because it had been left by a man named Gerald, whose truck had failed inspection 3 times in 3 years for a different thing he declined to fix from the previous visit, and who had on one occasion called my front desk assistant a word I will not repeat here, which was how our professional relationship had concluded. Gerald and I had a complicated history that had nothing to do with the woman standing in front of me, and I wasn't going to explain it. She said, "Can I at least get a loaner? We don't do loaners." I told her that. She said, "What kind of shop doesn't have loaners?" Not as a question, but as an editorial. The kind you design to float in the air and make someone feel the weight of it. I have been in this business long enough to recognize the difference between someone who is genuinely frustrated and someone who is performing frustration to see if it moves you. She was doing both at the same time. The frustration was real. The performance was a habit she probably didn't know she had. I said I would call her when the car was ready. She left without saying thank you. My assistant Marcus watched the whole exchange from behind the parts counter, arms crossed, and when the door swung shut, he gave me the look I've seen from him approximately 400 times, the one that says, "How are you that calm?" I am calm because I've been doing this long enough to understand something that took me years to learn. The woman who just insulted us is going to be stranded somewhere cold in a parking lot if her car doesn't get fixed. And fixing cars is the thing I know how to do. So I do it. That is the whole philosophy. It fits on a bumper sticker if you need it to. I went into the bay and fixed the alternator. It took 90 minutes. While I had the car open, I found something else. The negative battery terminal was corroding at the base. The kind of slow creep that takes 2 more Chicago winters to become a problem, and then becomes it all at once, stranding someone at 7:30 in the morning in a parking garage with a dead engine and a phone at 8%. It took me 4 minutes and $3 in materials to clean it and treat it. I noted it on the intake form as complimentary service and did not add it to her invoice. My father did this. His father did this before him. The rule is, if you see something small while you have the car, and fixing it will keep someone out of a bad situation, you fix it. Decency is strategy. Or maybe just decency. I have never been entirely sure where one ends and the other begins, and I've stopped trying to figure out the difference. I closed the invoice and called her number. She did not answer. I left a voicemail. The car was ready. $340. We're open until 6. I went home. I made dinner. I went to sleep. I came back the next morning at 7:15, which is when I always come in, and the car was still sitting in the lot. I called again at 9. Voicemail, Marcus, pulling a fuel filter on the car in the next bay, said over his shoulder, "Maybe she's ghosting you." I told him to stop narrating my life and handed him a clean filter. He said, "Seriously though, what if she just doesn't come back? You eating 340? I said I would deal with that when and if it happened, and not a minute before. By noon she texted, not called, texted, to say she'd be there by 5 and to please hold the car. We were closing at 5. I said yes. I went back to work. At 4:57, a rideshare pulled into the lot. Not her car. Her car was 8 feet away from where I was standing, right where I'd parked it. A different car, an Uber, and she stepped out of it. She was wearing the same jacket as the day before, and she had the look of someone who'd slept poorly in a room that was too warm. The specific kind of exhaustion that lives separately in the jaw and the eyes. She walked to the counter without hurrying and handed me her card without speaking. I ran it. It went through on the first try. I handed her the keys. She stood at the counter with the keys in her hand for a moment. She said, "Thank you." Not thank you, I guess. Not thank you finally. Not thank you with a tone that carries a subordinate clause about all the ways this could have gone differently. Just thank you, plain, the way you say something when you've decided to mean it. I said, "Drive safe." I meant it the way I always mean it, which is entirely. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment. I wasn't watching directly, but I heard the door close. And then nothing for about 10 seconds, which is a different quality of pause than someone fumbling for their phone. And then she started the car and pulled out of the lot. The alternator was quiet. It should have been. I'd checked it twice. Marcus came out of the garage wiping his hands on a blue shop rag and watched her turn out of the lot and said, "She going to review us?" I said I had no idea. He said, "She should. You should have charged her for the terminal too." I told him to go home. He went, but not before the look. I didn't explain it to him. There is nothing wrong with what I do. I have a policy, which I don't call a policy, because it sounds too formal for something that's just the way I work, and it's simple. If I see something small while I have a car and fixing it keeps someone out of a problem, I fix it, and I don't charge them. The only note I keep is on the intake form, so I know it was done. My father did this his entire career. He said a shop that only fixes what it's asked to fix is just a contractor. A shop that notices things is something else. That should have been the end of it. It was the end of it for 6 days. On the 7th day, a Thursday, gray October, the kind of cold that's making a point, she came back. Not because the car had broken again. Not because she had a billing dispute. She came through the front door carrying a bunch of yellow flowers with a paper cone around the stems, the kind from the display near the grocery store checkout, and she set them on the counter between us and said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at the flowers. I looked at her. I said, "Is the car running okay?" She said the car was running perfectly. I said, "Then you don't owe us anything." She said, "I was awful to you. I have a way of handling this kind of moment that I didn't design but that I've noticed I do. I don't make people live inside their worst behavior when they've already decided to walk away from it." So I said, "You were having a bad day," because that was true, and because it was the version that would let her breathe. She said, "I've been having a bad year." She said it the way someone reads a line from a form. Matter of fact, no bid for sympathy, just the information delivered so we could move past it. And I keep taking it out on people who don't deserve it, and I've been going back. She glanced at the flowers. "You were the third." I said, "The third." She said, "There was a checkout clerk named Bev. She was very gracious. And my sister, on her birthday, which I'm still working on." She looked at me directly, which some people don't manage when they're apologizing because they're afraid of what they'll find. "I'm sorry. You were kind to me and I was unkind back, and that's not who I want to be." I thanked her. Then, I asked if she wanted coffee. She sat down on the waiting bench, the one with the slightly uneven leg that Marcus keeps saying he's going to fix. and she held a cup of the bad coffee from our corner machine. And we talked for 40 minutes, while Marcus found increasingly implausible reasons to walk through the waiting area. By the third pass, I was fairly sure he was inventing reasons. Her name was Dana. She worked in nonprofit administration, grants, program compliance, the specialized language of applying for money from organizations that have it and getting it to people who need it. 7 years of it. She told me she'd recently found out that someone she had trusted completely, a counterpart at a partner organization, 4 years of working together on 3 different programs, had been misreporting program data. Not for personal gain, she thought, though the law didn't particularly care about that distinction. He had been desperate and frightened and had started rounding numbers slightly upward in his reports, and then couldn't find a moment to stop. She had found out when an auditor found out. She had been the one to turn him in. She had been the one to call the families who depended on the program and tell them services were paused pending review. Since October, I've been a disaster, she said. I snapped at Bev because the self-checkout machine was going slow, and she was trying to help. I said something unkind to my sister about a birthday gift and immediately wanted to take it back, and couldn't. And then I came in here and held up a 2-star Yelp review like it was evidence of something. She wrapped both hands around the paper cup. I came back because I couldn't stop thinking about it. I don't like being the person who does that. I said that sounded like useful information about herself to have. She said, "Does it?" "It doesn't feel like it helps much." I said it helped considerably more than the alternative, which was being that person and not knowing it. She looked at me for a moment in the particular way people look at you when something you said landed differently than they expected. Then she said, "My name is Dana." I said my name was Roy, though she probably already knew that. She said she knew. She'd read it off the sign. The following Thursday, her check engine light had come on overnight. She called ahead this time, politely. She showed up with a hardcover book, an actual book, not her phone, which I noticed because people don't usually bring books to a shop wait anymore. We diagnosed it in 45 minutes, a loose gas cap sensor, $12. The most anticlimactic outcome possible. She looked genuinely let down when I told her, which told me something about why she'd come. I said, "Same time next week for the tire rotation you may not actually need yet?" She laughed, the first time I'd heard it. Quick and startled, the kind that gets out before you decide to let it. She said, "Is it that obvious?" I said, "You brought a book for a 45-minute wait." She said, "I finished the chapter." The third Thursday, she had a real problem. A grinding sensation when she braked at highway speed. Front rotors warping. 2 hours, $210, exactly what it costs. She sat in the waiting area with her book. Marcus, who had by this point entered her in the parts log as Thursday's Civic, managed to find 4 separate reasons to get water from the waiting room fountain in the same 2-hour stretch. A personal record. By December, I knew things about Dana that took a while to know. Her brother Paul was funny in a way that made her proud and a little sad simultaneously, because he was funnier with strangers than with his own family, and she didn't know what to do with that. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a man who eventually told her he loved her, but found her a lot, and who seemed genuinely surprised when she said a lot was not something she was prepared to reduce herself to fix. She kept a list in her phone called things I still believe that she'd started in the spring when she needed something to hold on to, and she added to it on hard days. She never told me what was on it. I never asked. What she knew about me by December was more than most people get. I am not someone who gives out information about himself cheaply. I have reasons for this that I have examined enough to know they're real and not just habits, A business partnership that cost me $40,000 and 18 months of misplaced trust. And a relationship that ended not in a fight but in the slow accumulation of a woman I cared about saying, "You're consistent," in a tone that meant it as a diagnosis rather than a compliment. I spent 2 years after that relationship thinking about the difference between being consistent and being closed, whether there is one, and whether I was capable of knowing which one I was doing at any given moment. I still think about it on slow Tuesday afternoons when the work runs out. But Dana asked questions the way a good diagnostician listens to an engine. Patient, unhurried, not rushing past the sound toward the conclusion she'd already decided on. She'd ask something, and then she'd let the silence sit after it. And in the silence I'd say more than I intended. And she'd listen in a way that felt less like being studied and more like being kept. I told her about my father building this shop from a single bay and a reputation for warranty work on dealership overflows, about Marcus, who I'd hired at 19 because he'd fixed his mother's Caravan in a grocery store parking lot using a socket set, a zip tie, and a YouTube tutorial he'd watched on a phone with a cracked screen, and who had asked me afterward what I would have done without the zip tie, and had known the answer before I gave it. About the year the shop nearly went under, a competitor opened 2 blocks away with lower prices and a loyalty app and a clean waiting room with real coffee. And how we survived it by picking up warranty contracts from 3 dealerships, and by running for 8 months on 4 hours of sleep, and the particular stubbornness that comes from having your father's name on the sign. I told her the moment I knew we were going to be okay. The competitor had started advertising free coffee in their waiting room, and I looked at that ad and understood something. If free coffee was their differentiator, we were not in the same business. We had never been in the same business. I did not need to compete with them. I needed to keep doing what I had always done, which was the work, right? Without shortcuts, by people who understood what they were doing. Everything else is theater. Donna said, "That's it? That's the whole play?" I said that was the whole play. She looked at me the way she sometimes did, like she was adding a line to something she was keeping track of. In January, the competitor 2 blocks over had an electrical fire. No injuries, nothing catastrophic, but they closed for 3 weeks for repairs, and their walk-in customers needed somewhere to go. We had a full bay for most of January. I brought in a temporary tech to handle overflow. One of the new walk-ins was a man named Paul. Late model sedan, very clean, the car of someone who takes care of things. His car didn't go through on the first try. He didn't flinch, just said try it again, with the patience of someone who knows the problem is the card, not the machine. It went through on the second attempt. While we sorted the paperwork, he mentioned, without particular emphasis, that he was planning to open a second location and was looking for service partners for fleet maintenance. 20-plus vehicles, quarterly contracts. I said I'd be interested in hearing more. He said his business manager would call. 3 days later, Donna called. She said, "This is a professional call," before I said anything, in the careful tone of someone who has rehearsed the opening. "I need to disclose something that may be relevant." I said, "Go ahead." She said Paul was her brother. She had given him my number months ago, when he'd mentioned needing a new service shop, and she'd only found out he'd actually come in when he'd mentioned the shop's name at a family dinner, and she had, in her words, inhaled a piece of bread incorrectly. She said she understood if I wanted to decline the contract, because it was complicated. She also said she understood if I just didn't want to, for any reason. She wasn't asking. I said, "Is he honest?" She said, "He's the most honest person I know. He's also genuinely the most annoying, in a way that is completely unrelated to his honesty and doesn't seem to bother him." I said, "I'll take the call." She paused. She said, "You're not going to ask anything else." I said I'd asked what I needed to ask. Another pause. She said, "Roy." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why are you always so calm?" It was the second time she'd asked me that. The first had been through Marcus, early on, and Marcus had passed it along the way Marcus passes along information he finds personally useful. I had thought about it more than I'd expected to. I said, "Because when I'm not calm, I make bad decisions. And I've made enough bad decisions over enough years to understand very clearly what the calm costs and what the alternative costs. The calm is cheaper." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm putting that on the list." I said, "The things I still believe list?" She said, "That list." I said she was going to need more pages. She said it was already pretty long. The fleet contract came through in February. 22 vehicles, quarterly service cycles, real numbers. It changed the shop's math for the year in an uncomplicated and welcome way. I gave Marcus the raise he should have gotten 8 months earlier. I hired a second full-time technician named Dario, who was quiet and precise in a way that reminded me of watching someone read very carefully. He didn't rush, and he didn't miss things, and when he found something wrong, he described it the same way, whether it cost $200 or $2,000. Dana texted when the contract signed. The text said, "Paul is insufferable now. He keeps telling people he's the reason we know each other." I told him you were the reason. He said that's not how stories work. "Tell him." I texted back, "Tell him he's not wrong." She sent back, "I regret this conversation." I sent, "No, you don't." A pause. Then, "No, I don't." We had dinner in March. Not planned, exactly. She was supposed to meet a friend near the shop, and the friend had canceled. And she came by the way she came by on Thursdays, and I was eating a sandwich at the parts counter because I'd worked through lunch. And she looked at the sandwich with an expression I had come to recognize as her about to say something honest. And she said, "That is bleak." I said it was efficient. She said, "Come have dinner with me." As a mercy. We split a bottle of wine at a restaurant I would not have chosen for myself. Cloth napkins. Menu that was also a small book, the kind of place where the lighting is doing a lot of quiet work. She made me try something I wouldn't have ordered. It was good, and I said so, and she looked pleased in the way people do when they know something about you didn't know yourself. I told her about the worst repair I had ever attempted, which involved a 1987 pickup, a previous owner who had used expanding foam as a makeshift gasket material on at least 3 different components, and 40 minutes of Marcus and me standing next to the engine with our arms at our sides in a silence that kept not becoming words. She laughed until she had to set her glass down. I drove her home. She said goodnight at her door. I said goodnight. I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for a longer time than I would admit to Marcus, with the engine off and the windows starting to fog. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. I was doing the thing I do when something is settling into a new shape and I haven't decided yet what to call it. I have a theory about why I don't often call things what they are before I need to. The partnership that cost me $40,000. I knew 8 months in that something was wrong. The small lies, the accounting that didn't track, the way the man would change the subject when I asked direct questions, and I told myself I was imagining it. I chose not to pull the thread. I have thought about that many times in the years since, and the lesson I took from it is not to be more suspicious, but to be more honest with myself about what I'm already noticing. So I sat in my truck, and I was honest. And what I was noticing was that the dinner had been exactly as long as it needed to be, and I had not wanted it to end. Which told me something I had not quite let myself know yet. I went inside. I went to sleep. I came in the next morning at 7:15, and Marcus, who reads people the way he reads an engine, listening for the thing that is slightly off from the baseline, looked at me over his coffee and said nothing, which was its own kind of commentary. In April, she told me the full version of what had happened at her organization. The version I'd heard on the waiting bench in October had been accurate, but abbreviated. The full version had one detail she'd left out. She had known something was off with her partner's data as early as August, 2 full months before the auditor found anything. Not proof. Not anything she could have pointed to and called evidence. Pattern. She knew this man's rhythms, the specific way his language shifted when he was uncertain about something, the frequency and confidence of his routine reporting, and something had been slightly wrong in both for several months. She had told herself it was her own stress she was projecting. She had chosen not to pull the thread, because she was already overextended, and she needed to believe in her partner program, and because pulling threads is a thing that tends to unravel more than the thread you were pulling. She told me this at dinner, the second dinner, a different restaurant. And she told it without excusing herself, and without performing guilt, just as a thing that had happened and that she was still carrying, which is the only honest way to carry something. She said, "You're going to say something reasonable now." I said, "I'm trying to decide if reasonable is the right register." She said, "Is it?" I said, "Tell me what you've done with it since you knew." She told me she had redesigned the partner organization's internal audit protocol from the ground up, built in staggered verification cycles, anonymous flagging mechanisms for field staff, quarterly cross-checks that couldn't be bypassed by a single person with data access. She had presented the new protocol at a regional non-profit conference in the spring. 3 other organizations had already adopted versions of it. She had also visited every one of the 22 affected families personally, alongside the program director, the week services resumed. She had looked them in the face and explained what had happened and what was being done about it. I said, "You noticed something wrong and you looked away, and then you kept looking away until you couldn't. And when you couldn't look away anymore, you looked at everything." She said, "That's a generous way to read it." I said it's the version that accounts for what actually happened, including the part before August. She said quietly, "Roy, it's not generous." "I sat with the wrong thing for 2 months," I said, "and then you built something that will stop 20 other people from doing the same thing. Those aren't separate. They're the same story." She looked at the table. She said, "I keep coming to your shop because you see things the right size. Not bigger than they are, not smaller." I said things were usually the size they were. She said, "Most people resize them on purpose, for their own comfort or for yours. You don't do that." I said that seemed like the least you could offer someone. She said, "Roy, it's not." In May, Paul came in with his second fleet vehicle for routine service and brought himself along for the wait. He sat in the waiting area with exactly his sister's posture, straight-backed, something to read, the particular self-sufficiency of a person who has learned to occupy a space without demanding anything from it. He introduced himself with a handshake that meant it and said Dana had said good things. I said she'd said good things about him too, excluding the part about being annoying. He laughed the way she'd told me he would, big, surprised, a little embarrassed to find himself delighted, like it had snuck past his guard. He said, "She's happy." He said it the way you say something you've been holding carefully for a while and are setting down, not a report. A fact he was presenting for my consideration. I said I knew. He said, "She hasn't been happy in a while. Since before last October." I said I knew that too. He looked at me for a moment and then said he was going to get a coffee, and he did not ask any more questions. Which meant, I understood, that he had asked the ones that mattered. June. The shop's annual state inspection. For the third year in a row, the inspector was a man named Walt, who had, over 3 years, managed to communicate without ever stating it plainly that certain shops in the district handled the inspection relationship through an informal arrangement. I had declined that arrangement 3 times, quietly, and for 2 years the inspection had passed on the second visit rather than the first, each time with a written note about a documentation deficiency. Filing, my bays are tight, my work is fully certified, my technicians are licensed. But paperwork, organizational systems, documentation flow, had not been where I put my attention. And Walt had found that seam both years and used it. In April, Dana had looked at my file organization with the same eyes she had turned on her own organization's protocols in the wake of the audit disaster. She built me something I could actually navigate. Indexed folders sorted by inspection category, a checklist protocol, a documentation log that Marcus could maintain without instructions. It took her a Sunday afternoon and 2 cups of coffee at my desk. She said it was restful to fix something she could fully see. The June inspection passed on the first visit. Walt looked at his clipboard for a moment, longer than he needed to. He looked at me. He noted, with no particular expression, that the documentation was comprehensive. I said I'd had some help. He wrote something on his form and left. I stood in the lot for a moment in the June air, thinking about a woman who had walked into my shop in October, carrying a Yelp review as a weapon, and about how the best defense against most things is just doing the work right and having documentation and being patient. I did not plan what I said. I want to be honest about this because the version where I planned it would have sounded like someone I'm not, and she would have recognized that immediately. What happened is she came by on a Thursday in late June. The dog she'd been fostering had a follow-up appointment. The veterinary clinic was on this side of town. The shop was on the way, and I had finished everything I had for the afternoon. And I came out to the waiting area and sat down next to her on the bench with the uneven leg. She looked at me for a moment and said, "You look like you want to say something." I said I did. She put the book on the bench beside her. I said, "I have been trying to figure out for 8 months how it is that a person changes you without you noticing the moment it starts. And I think the answer is, they just keep showing up in the same place. And at some point you realize you've been counting on that. And then you realize that the counting on it is something you didn't know you needed. And then you realize you don't want to stop counting on it." She did not say anything for a moment. The shop was quiet behind us. Dario was in the bay working through something that required patience, and he was being patient. She said, "I almost didn't come back. After the flowers, I was so ashamed of the person I'd been that first day that I almost just wrote it off as a story where I was the villain and you'd long since moved on. I told myself you'd forgotten me anyway. I said, 'I remembered your car.' She said, 'What?' I said, 'Before I remembered you, I remembered the car.' 2019 Civic, pearl white. Inspection sticker due in November." She started to laugh and didn't stop herself. She said, "That is the most Roy thing you have ever said in our entire acquaintance." I said, "Is that good?" She said, "It's very good." Marcus found out from Paul, because Paul called to follow up on a fleet scheduling question and mentioned, in passing, that his sister had said something at a recent dinner that had apparently involved the phrase "counting on," and that he was relaying this for informational purposes only and not because he was in any way invested in how it landed, which is the sort of thing Paul says when he is very invested. Marcus texted me a wrench emoji and a flower emoji placed side by side, which I chose to interpret as professional encouragement rather than commentary, and did not respond to. He brought it up the next morning in person, briefly, and then had the good sense to let it alone. Marcus has a gift for knowing when to push and when to let a man work in peace, and I have never told him I appreciate it, but I do. The November inspection sticker I did myself, in October, on a Thursday afternoon when her car was in for a coolant flush and I had a quiet hour. I rotated the tires as well, because I'd been monitoring the wear pattern on the rear since August, and they were ready. I knocked $10 off the labor, retroactively, for the gas cap sensor she'd paid full price for in October, because I'd been meaning to and kept finding other things to do instead. She looked at the invoice when I handed it to her and said I didn't have to do that. I said I knew. She looked more carefully. She said, "Roy, you fixed my car for free that first time, didn't you?" I said I didn't know what she was referring to. She said, "The alternator was $340. You charged me $340. But you also replaced the battery terminal at the negative lead, and I saw it noted on the intake form. And you didn't charge me for it." I said terminal cleaning was a complimentary service. She said that wasn't on the sign. I said it should be. She looked at me the way she looks when she is deciding whether to let something go or say the thing she is actually thinking. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because the car was going to leave the lot either way, and if it left clean, it was less likely to come back in with a bigger problem." I stopped. She said, "And?" I said, "And you were upset. And sometimes people are upset because something is genuinely hard, and the only decent thing you can do, when you can see that, is fix what's in front of you and not add to it." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I came back with flowers." I said, "You did." She said, "I'll keep doing that." I said I wouldn't mind at all. Have you ever let someone in only after they gave you a reason not to, and realized later that the reason was actually a door? And have you ever known someone who was quiet about their own goodness, who never named what they were doing, who just kept doing it, so that you didn't understand what had happened to you until you were already different? If you have, tell us who that person was. We read every single one.